Hey, Steve, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks, Joshua, for having me.
So I saw some recent headlines. I know you were posting about it. They're talking about this so-called Doomsday glacier. And, I remember in the early days of the whole climate change narrative that they were saying there was going to be a big glacier that was going to sink into the ocean and raise the water levels. And we'd all be living in like tiny island communities and all the cities would be underwater. What is this narrative?
Well, so in West Antarctica, there's a glacier called the Thwaites Glacier, and it has been nicknamed the Doomsday Glacier. And climate lore has it that when this finally breaks off and disintegrates, it's going to raise sea level by 10 feet. And of course, this has never been true. First off, it's whatever is going on in the Thwaites, it's got no relation to emissions. West Antarctica has been cooling for the past 20 years. The Thwaites Glacier sits atop volcanic activity. People have dialed back the scare from 10 feet to really just a millimeter or two over the next 50 to 100 years of sea level rise. So it's really nothing at all. But then this week, a new study came out saying that, the disintegration of the Thwaites Glacier actually began in the 1940s when there was this huge El Niño. We're in an El Niño year right now, and it causes a lot of warming. It's this natural phenomenon that occurs in the Pacific, and it warms the whole planet. And so one of those in 1940 got the Thwaites Glacier off on its start. So this whole Doomsday Glacier, or that the Thwaites is at all related to climate, is just, it's just total junk science.
I want to get a bit into the El Niño effect in a bit, but I want to talk more about the glacier first, because, I know climate scientists and people who are into this would say, well, aren't there islands in the Pacific where the water's rising and the people are having to flee and leave the islands? What would you say to that?
Well, there's no example of that. We've been hearing about, the Marshall Islands and Tuvalu, these other islands in the Pacific, and in the Indian Ocean. We've been hearing about how sea level is just going to swamp them and people are going to have to leave. Well, that has not happened. As a matter of fact, in many of these islands, they've actually gained territory. The Marshall Islands, for example, Tuvalu is another one. There's been no evidence that sea level rise, which has been pretty constant since before industrialization. I mean, sea level rise is a complex phenomenon. It's got nothing to do with emissions. So these islands are not sinking. Some of them are actually accreting. No one is fleeing. Their economies are actually doing quite well. It's all just, it's just another part of the climate hoax that has not worked out.
Interesting. But, if you turn on New York Times and you read about the migrant crisis, they say all these people are actually climate migrants and they're fleeing the effects of climate change. Briefly, I can tell you, being serious, all right, I was actually in Panama and I interviewed a lot of them. I did not meet a single person who said they were fleeing climate change. Everybody said they were either fleeing gang violence, where these loose on crime policies, or they were fleeing socialism. It was one of the two.
There's no question.
I mean, are there examples of people fleeing climate change? I mean, is there any place where climate change has caused such a crisis that people have to flee into Europe or the United States? Do we have any examples of this?
No, once again, there's no example of anyone fleeing an area because of climate. I mean, people flee because of, bad government, corrupt government, invasion. But no one has left because of climate change. I mean, people may move because of drought, but drought has got nothing to do with climate change either. People are coming from Latin America because our borders are wide open. And there's more economic opportunity for many people here than in various parts of Latin America. So this has got nothing to do with climate. The climate industrial complex has gotten to the point where everything is blamed on climate because they have conditioned now 20 years worth of secondary school students into believing that climate is the root of all evil, and it's just false.
Well, let's talk about the El Niño effect, because I understand this is a global phenomenon that does in fact happen. But the media, as far as I've seen, has been very disingenuous with it. They're
Yeah.
using this effect that always rotates one to the other, just every, I believe 10 years roughly.
Yeah.
And it's being used to create these narratives. Can you explain to me what this effect is?
Well, sure. So the El Nino La Nina, it's a cycle. It's called the ENSO cycle, but we think of it as El Nino La Nina. El Nino is a warmer cycle. La Nina is a cooler cycle. It comes out of the Pacific. It's not caused by humans at all. We think maybe it's got something to do with geothermal heating in the Pacific Ocean. In the Pacific they have that ring of fire, these underwater volcanoes. Maybe it's got something to do with that. No one knows for sure. But it is periodic, and it warms the planet. Now, the significance of this is that during the 20th century, there was a significant amount of warming in the first part of the 20th century. Then, in the middle part of the 20th century, it started to cool, and then around 1980, things started warming up again. And that's coincidentally when the series of El Niños that we're going through started. And every time there's an El Nino, the planet takes a sort of a step up in warming. And then when the El Nino is over, there's no warming at all. That's when we're in the La Nina phase. And then there's another step up in warming with the next El Nino. So this is what we've seen. People remember 1998 was a very warm year, and then it sort of cooled down for a while. There was actually 14 years of no warming despite all the emissions. And then there was another El Nino in 2015, took a step up. And then last year there was another El Nino, and we've taken a step up. So, El Nino is really what's driving the warming that we've been observing for the last 40 years. That climate alarmists have been talking about. It's not emissions, because in between these El Ninos there's no warming, but there's still lots of emissions.
Well, and I know some people would say, well, how do we know? Maybe El Nino is climate change, and maybe it's caused by human action and carbon emissions and so on. What would you tell people in terms of that?
Well, the El Nino comes out of the Pacific. It's natural. It's not. It's not caused by emissions. Everybody agrees that it's not caused by emissions. Even the alarmists.
So it's a long-term trend, in other words.
It's just a natural. We don't really understand it. It's a phenomenon that occurs. And then when the El Nino is over, we go into this La Nina phase, during which there's no warming. For example, in the beginning of the 2000s, despite all the emissions, 1 trillion tons of emissions, there was no warming because we were in a La Nina phase. So to me, that means that El Nino is what drives warming. It's not emissions, because when emissions by themselves, there's no evidence that they warm the planet. Because the warming only happens in the El Nino phase. When the El Nino's over, the planet cools off a little bit, actually. There's certainly no more warming, despite more emissions. So you cannot connect emissions with warming. You can only connect El Nino with warming.
Interesting. Yeah, I had to look at your Twitter or X account. I follow you on there, and I saw you had a lot of charts showing actual global temperatures, and it looks, I believe going back to before the 70s, and they're actually pretty stable. They rise and fall a little bit, but it seems there's no real difference between now and the earliest data we have. Can you explain that to me?
Right. So that's more of this El Nino. So the last El Nino was in 2015, and it took another step up in warming. But then since 2015, despite just about 500 billion tons of emissions, there was no warming until the next El Nino, which happened at the end of 2023. And we took another step up. And these steps are so large, they're not explainable by emissions. Emissions sort of gradually creep up. And Al Gore's theory was emissions are like, putting a frog in a pan of water and gradually turning up the heat. Well, that is not what we observe in the real world. What we observe in the real world is steady temperatures until there's an El Nino year. There's a step up in warming. And, but then we have steady temperatures again. And then at the next El Nino, there's a slight step up in warming. And El Ninos have been happening since before industrialization. So it's pretty clear that the El Nino effect cannot be explained by emissions at all because it predates emissions. And then physically, there's no explanation because emissions are gradually and continually increasing, whereas El Nino is periodic, and you can see the warming happening just in the El Nino years.
Very interesting. Yeah, I want to talk about something else with you, which is the electric vehicle sham coming out now. Because one of the things I know I've been saying, and I've seen you've been saying as well, is that the industry, global warming or global cooling or climate change, whatever they want to call it at the current moment, it's actually not necessarily a global standard. And you have countries like China that are capitalizing on it. They're gaining, monopolies over industries, and even in some instances finding loopholes to get taxpayer dollars to build things like electric vehicles.
Yeah.
Can we start by talking about electric vehicles? I saw you were talking about the difference between EVs and hybrids, and I found that interesting. Can you tell me kind of the difference in let's say efficiency between EVs and hybrids?
Well, so EVs run on just electricity, no gasoline at all. Hybrids run on a mix of electricity and gasoline. And there was a story in the Washington Post this morning showing how some hybrids are actually more efficient than pure EVs. For me, this is all nonsense. None of these, no EV, no hybrid is any greener than any conventional gasoline-powered car when you get right down to it. EVs are not changing the weather. They're not going to improve the weather. They're not changing the climate. They're not going to improve the climate. They're not affecting the environment in any meaningful way. They just cost more. And taxpayers have to pay for this. Consumers have to pay for this. Because of EV demand, there's slave labor, child slave labor in the Congo mines owned by the communist Chinese. And of course, you can't build an EV without communist China because various components all come 100% come from communist China. And this actually goes to all green technology. The more green technology, wind, solar, EVs, what have you, that we are forced to use, the more dependent we become on communist China, the more we send taxpayer subsidies like the Inflation Reduction Act. That money is just going to China, okay? Because that's where all this stuff comes from.
Explain that to me. How is the money from the Inflation Reduction Act going to China?
Well, we are subsidizing wind turbines and solar panels and EVs. Many of the materials for these cars and wind turbines and all these green sources of energy comes from China. So eventually the subsidies, to the extent that we're building more of this stuff because of the subsidies, a lot of the subsidies are going back to China. So we're enriching China, we're empowering China because we're just becoming dependent on China. There's no EV battery that is not 100% dependent on communist China, for example, processed graphite. Okay. Now, the significance of this is I look at the war in Ukraine, and I say, well, this is caused by climate policies. Since the late 1990s, with the Kyoto Protocol, Europe started basically disarming itself in terms of energy. They stopped coal mining. They stopped drilling for oil and gas. They let Putin stop their, fracking. Environmentalists stopped fracking, and so Europe just became dependent on oil and gas and coal from Russia. And of course, when the time was right and Europe was sufficiently dependent and Russia had been sufficiently enriched by the Europeans, well, the invasion happened. This would not have happened under President Trump because you remember under President Trump we had American energy dominance, and President Trump had basically crushed, between fracking and President Trump, we had crushed the price of oil. At the beginning of COVID, Russia and Saudi Arabia actually had to go into an oil production war because the price of oil had gone, and forcing the price of oil below zero, if you can believe that. You have to pay people to take oil. But since Joe Biden Europe has continued to enrich and re-empower Russia, and this is what happened. So this is what's going to happen with China. We are enriching China. We are sending taxpayer money to communist China. We are making ourselves dependent. If you buy an EV, you just become dependent on communist China. So school buses, delivery trucks, all this stuff is just going to be dependent on China. Wind, solar, we don't make these things here. We don't process, even if we were to mine for some of the rare earth minerals in the US, we don't process any of that. That all happens in China. So we're just making ourselves dependent on communist China. Now, they're supposed to be our geopolitical rival, but nobody in this country is really treating them as that. And, China has this goal of becoming the lone global superpower by 2049, and we're just playing into their hands.
Of course, I speak with a lot of people in the Chinese, security community, and this is one of the big concerns going around is that, through the United Nations, the Chinese Communist Party has a huge influence over the UN, and they're pushing, this is one of the concerns at least, that the CCP and other US adversaries are pushing these types of green policies with the purpose of weakening and tearing down the US and giving a monopoly on high technology and energy and cars and everything like that to China. Do you think there's any ground for this based on what you've seen?
Yes, I think this is the Chinese strategy. Why go to war when you can, make your enemy completely dependent on you? So China is making the U.S. dependent on China, and it's also doing the same thing to Western Europe. It's war by other means. The West has put all sorts of economic sanctions on Russia. Europe is trying to stop buying oil. They still buy oil and gas from Russia, but they cut back. But who has stepped up? China. So China is using everything it can think of, every peaceful means it can think of to make us completely dependent and to undercut us. And unfortunately, there are many people in the American government, including the leadership, which really doesn't get this yet. And by the time they do, if they ever do, it's going to be too late. There are already many things that we need that are only made in China, like antibiotics. Now, what's going to happen if China decides to invade Taiwan? Is America going to be able to do anything? No, because if we do, we're not going to have any antibiotics. Let alone solar, wind, EV technology, and many other things, smartphones. Just a lot of the chip market is done in Taiwan. China's going to. We're not going to have anything. We can't afford to defend Taiwan because our economy will be destroyed, and that's the position our leadership has put us in. The Chinese, they're very smart. Their country may. Their people may not be, have a very high standard of living, but the leadership is very smart. They've sort of rope-a-doped the American government into making us dependent on China. And we're at a very dangerous point.
I saw that they're also finding some loopholes with this as well. I saw you posting about how they were building some of these plants in Mexico to bypass U.S. sanctions. Is this really happening right now?
Yeah, I guess. I just found out about this yesterday. They want to be able to take it. So the Inflation Reduction Act has a lot of subsidies for green materials and EVs. But the law says that the EVs, for example, need to substantially be made in America. And I guess there are exceptions for cars made in Mexico. And so the Chinese have figured out how to game the system. And so they're going to be building cars in Mexico and flooding the U.S. market with them and destroying the U.S. car companies. China has an up-and-coming EV company, I believe it's called BYD, and they're already overtaking Tesla in terms of sales. They're going to come into the U.S. market. They're going to, because we have an open market. You can't sell American cars in China, but you can sell Chinese cars in America. And they're just going to undercut us. They're going to destroy the U.S. auto industry. Not that the U.S. auto industry is not destroying itself by its own EV activities. Last year Ford lost $30,000 per EV sold, which is just incredible. So, we have senseless policy run by, I think, corrupt politicians, because how else can you explain these? What's going on is so bad. The deals that the Biden administration has entered into, the legislation is just so bad. It's got to be done on purpose.
Well, and I feel there's a bit of like collective amnesia going on, where people are being made to forget even very recent history. Like, as you mentioned, how was it that we were a net producer of oil? Like, we were exporting it. We had more than we could use. And then suddenly it's all gone, and we're dependent on, ironically, Russia and Iran, or Russia and Saudi Arabia and these other countries for our oil. I mean, how did that work? What was the reality when we were like an exporter of oil under Trump just a few years ago? Like, what did that, and what did they change to eliminate that?
Right. So Trump's policy was just to unleash the U.S. energy industry, and to unleash the U.S. energy industry for good. And, the fact that, America was willing to produce all the oil and gas it could, and this is possible because of fracking technology. The fact that we were willing to do that, and we had politicians that were willing to do that, put us in charge of the global price of oil. During Trump, we took that away from OPEC. Until Trump, OPEC was in charge of the price of oil. Now, enter Joe Biden, and Joe Biden's policy is to shut down the oil and gas industry, to destroy it. I mean, he said that during the campaign. And so the fact that America was not going to produce oil and gas anymore, or at least, on a long-term basis, that put OPEC back in charge of the market. Because, OPEC is smart enough to know that nothing happens in our world without fossil fuels. And if America is not going to produce fossil fuels, oil and gas anymore, well, OPEC will, and OPEC will meet those needs, and OPEC will be, once again, large and in charge. Now, during the Biden administration, ironically, we are producing more oil than ever before, even than under Trump, but we're not in charge of the price of oil anymore. And the reason for that, and this is important, is that Joe Biden is making U.S. oil companies use up their existing reserves and not allowing them to obtain new reserves. So we're basically just running out our oil market. Our oil companies are taking advantage of the high price of oil by producing everything they have now, but Biden is not allowing them to find new reserves. So we are essentially, running out of oil, selling it as fast as we can. And, unless we get a new administration that allows oil companies to, once again, drill on public lands for oil and gas and coal, it is important that our coal industry come back as well, because we use coal to generate electricity, which is very useful because it makes us not dependent on natural gas. And it's important to have that flexibility. And so President Trump will bring that back.
Well, and this does raise some questions for me around why are they doing this, and are there people making money off it? Are they trying to sabotage the United States? Because in my mind, I'm thinking, Venezuela is talking about invading Guyana right now, where they just found one of the world's largest oil reserves. Yeah. And if they're able, between Venezuela, the Middle East, and of course Russia, able to get a monopoly on the global oil supply, and we're still buying it because obviously we need it. Look at Europe, where they tried getting away from it and they're still buying from Russia, in natural gas. What is the future? I mean, are we being sold out? Are we being intentionally destroyed? What is happening in your understanding?
Well, I think there's a lot of bad actors at work. There's a lot of different motivations. I mean, we have, let's start with our own government. We have the Bidens, which, allegations of corruption abound, right? And I don't think it's limited to the Bidens. Wall Street is very interested in China and all this green stuff because they get the subsidies. The American Greens, I wrote a book 15 years ago, Green Hell, How Environmentalists Plan to Control Your Life. And what we're witnessing right now is how the Greens are basically controlling our lives, taking over, telling us, what kind of cars we can drive, what kind of food we can eat, etc. Then we have the foreign actors. I think China is the biggest threat because China does want to become the lone global superpower, and so China is doing everything it can to accomplish that without having to go to war. So they're taking advantage of corruption on Wall Street, corruption in our government. They have infiltrated every institution of the U.S. They're working with foreign governments. In Mexico, for example, we haven't even talked about, what they're doing in Mexico with fentanyl. And so, they are everywhere causing problems for us. And so it's all these bad actors together. It's like, Americans, the American government and Wall Street, no longer for America. They're out for themselves. And of course, the Chinese are taking advantage of all this.
Hey, Steve Malloy, really important stuff. Thank you so much for being here.
All right, Joshua, thank you.